The crystal chandeliers of Lord Hastings' ballroom cast dancing shadows across the marble floor as Eleanor Ashworth pressed her gloved fingers against the cool silk of her gown, trying to still their trembling while the orchestra's music swelled around her, and the clock on the mantel showed 2 minutes before midnight on this last evening of 1814. Lord Marcus Sinclair's warm hand at her elbow guided her through the crush of revellers toward the terrace doors, and Eleanor felt her heart flutter like a caged bird as she allowed herself to believe what seemed impossible after 4 seasons of being overlooked and dismissed by society. The deep blue velvet of her dress, adorned with modest silver embroidery that her mother had insisted was suitable for a woman of her age and station, whispered against her legs as they moved, and she caught sight of her younger sister Charlotte whirling past in the arms of a viscount, golden curls bouncing with each turn, while Eleanor herself had never been asked to dance at midnight on New Year's Eve until this very moment when Marcus had appeared at her side with that devastating smile. The terrace doors opened to reveal a world transformed by winter's touch, the stone balustrade dusted with frost that sparkled like scattered diamonds under the sharp starlight, and Eleanor's breath formed small clouds in the bitter, cold air as Marcus drew her outside into the private darkness beyond the ballroom's golden glow. Behind them, the sounds of laughter and music faded to a distant hum, while before them stretched Lord Hastings's formal garden, its hedges and pathways obscured by shadow and moonlight, creating an intimate world that seemed to exist solely for the two of them in this suspended moment before the year turned. Marcus turned to face her, his handsome features softened by the silvery light, and Eleanor felt decades of resignation and acceptance of her spinster fate crumble like autumn leaves as he stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne mingling with the crisp winter air and feel the warmth radiating from his body despite the cold that made her skin prickle with goosebumps beneath her evening gloves. Through the French doors, she glimpsed Lady Lydia Greville, watching them with those calculating green eyes that had dismissed Eleanor at countless social gatherings. But for once, Eleanor didn't care about the beautiful blonde's opinion because Marcus was speaking soft words she could barely hear over the sudden pounding of her pulse as the bells began to chime midnight. The first stroke rang out across London, echoing from church to church, and Marcus cupped her face in his hands with a gentleness that made tears prick at Eleanor's eyes, because no man had ever looked at her with such apparent desire, making her feel beautiful and wanted instead of plain and practical, as society had labelled her for so long. As the final stroke of midnight resonated through the frosty air, his lips met hers in a kiss that tasted of champagne and promises, while somewhere behind the glass doors, Lady Lydia Greville's perfect mouth curved into a knowing smirk that would haunt Eleanor's dreams. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The afternoon sun cast weak shadows through the lace curtains of the Ashworth drawing room as Eleanor floated down the stairs at 3 o'clock on New Year's Day, her heart still singing from the memory of Marcus's lips against hers just 14 hours before, the taste of champagne and promise lingering like a secret she hugged close to her chest, while the modest Mayfair townhouse seemed transformed by her newfound joy. The knocker sounded against the front door with unusual frequency for a holiday afternoon, and Eleanor smoothed her morning dress of soft rose muslin, anticipating perhaps a note from Marcus or even a visit to speak with her father about intentions. But as she entered the drawing room where their butler had admitted several callers, the atmosphere struck her like a physical blow. Mrs. Pemberton and Lady Ashford sat perched on the edge of the settee like carrion birds, their eyes glittering with something that made Eleanor's stomach tighten with the first tendril of unease, while behind them stood Miss Whitmore and her mother, both wearing expressions of barely concealed delight that had nothing to do with New Year wishes. The conversation halted abruptly at Eleanor's entrance, creating a silence so profound she could hear the mantel clock ticking and the distant clatter of carriages on the cobblestones outside, before Mrs. Pemberton cleared her throat with deliberate significance and remarked how brave dear Eleanor was to receive visitors after such an eventful evening. Eleanor's smile faltered as she took her seat, noticing how the ladies exchanged meaningful glances, and when she inquired politely about their health, Lady Ashford tittered behind her fan and said she supposed Eleanor must be quite exhausted from her midnight exertions, the word dripping with insinuation that made Eleanor's cheeks burn, though she didn't yet understand why. The drawing-room door stood slightly ajar, and through it drifted the voices of more callers in the entrance hall, their whispers carrying clearly in the winter air as someone mentioned that desperate Ashworth girl, and another voice added, throwing herself at Lord Sinclair in the most shameless fashion, while Eleanor's hands clenched in her lap, her mother too ill upstairs to navigate this social minefield, and her father hiding in his study as he always did when faced with anything unpleasant. Miss Whitmore leaned forward with false sympathy, her voice honeyed with poison as she relayed how Lord Sinclair had been at White's that very morning, laughing with the other gentlemen about the tedious wallflower who had practically dragged him onto the terrace, and when someone asked about his intentions, he had waved a dismissive hand and called the whole episode forgettable, insisting he had merely been foxed and seeking fresh air when Eleanor had followed him outside. The room spun slightly as Eleanor absorbed this information, her beautiful dream crumbling like ash, while Mrs. Pemberton added helpfully that Lady Lydia Greville had witnessed the entire scene and was quite shocked by Eleanor's forward behaviour, pursuing a gentleman who had clearly been trying to escape her clutches, and what a shame it was when girls forgot their place and made such desperate grabs for attention. Through the window, Eleanor glimpsed more carriages arriving, more visitors come to feast on her humiliation, and she understood with crystalline clarity that she was not receiving New Year calls, but had become the entertainment itself, her reputation shattered beyond repair by a kiss she had believed meant everything but apparently meant less than nothing to the man who had bestowed it. The grey morning light of January 15th filtered weakly through the frost-etched windows of Eleanor's bedchamber as she sat at her writing desk, mechanically sorting through the stack of returned calling cards that had accumulated over the past fortnight like fallen leaves after a storm, each one a small paper tombstone marking the death of another social connection she had once taken for granted. The face that gazed back from her mirror bore little resemblance to the hopeful woman who had floated down these same stairs on New Year's Day, for sleepless nights had carved shadows beneath her eyes, and worry had stolen the roses from her cheeks, leaving her looking older than her 24 years, while the house around her seemed to echo with absence and shame. The breakfast tray beside her sat untouched, for food had lost all appeal in the wake of her disgrace, and she could hear the servants whispering in the halls with that particular mixture of pity and scandal that marked a household touched by ruin, their voices carrying clearly in the unnatural quiet that had descended upon the modest Ashworth townhouse. 2 weeks had passed since that fateful midnight kiss, 2 weeks of complete social isolation, broken only by the cruel visits of those who came to gloat rather than comfort, and Eleanor had learned to armour herself in cold dignity, wrapping indifference around her heart like a winter cloak, while she watched her world crumble with the detached fascination of one observing a distant catastrophe. The Morning Post brought only bills and a letter from Charlotte, who wrote cheerfully from their aunt's country estate about assemblies and local society, carefully avoiding any mention of the scandal that had necessitated her removal from London to protect her own marriage prospects from the taint of association with her ruined sister. Eleanor's mother remained confined to her bed, too fragile to face the shame that had befallen their family, while her father haunted his study like a ghost, emerging only to look at Eleanor with eyes full of bewilderment and reproach, as if unable to comprehend how his sensible eldest daughter had brought such disaster upon them all. The stack of refused invitations told its own story of her fall from grace, each polite rejection another door closing in her face, until only one invitation remained unopened, its heavy cream paper bearing the Ravenscroft crest that made Eleanor's fingers tremble slightly as she considered whether to break the seal. Lady Harriet Pembroke had called yesterday, the only friend who still dared associate with the notorious Miss Ashworth, and over tea that Eleanor could barely swallow, Harriet had mentioned the Thornbury Ball scheduled for January 20th, describing it as the final grand event of the season before society scattered to their country estates. Eleanor had listened with the same detached courtesy she now showed to everything, her emotions locked away behind walls of ice. But something in Harriet's gentle insistence that Eleanor should not hide away entirely had sparked a tiny flame of defiance in her chest. Now, as she held the Ravenscroft invitation and felt its weight in her palm, Eleanor made a decision that surprised even herself. For if she was to be exiled from society forever, if she was to spend the rest of her days as a spinster dependent on her family's charity, then she would not slink away like a criminal, but would hold her head high for one final evening, showing the ton that their whispers and cruelty had not broken her spirit entirely. The Ravenscroft carriage wheels crunched over fresh snow as Eleanor alighted at the entrance to the magnificent townhouse at 8 o'clock on the evening of January 20th, her dove-grey silk gown chosen deliberately to reflect the death of her reputation, while Harriet descended behind her in cheerful yellow that seemed almost defiant against the winter darkness and Eleanor's sombre mood. The massive doors stood open to admit the glittering throng of London's elite, light spilling onto the pavement like molten gold, while the sounds of music and laughter drifted from within, creating a scene of such elegant prosperity that Eleanor felt her resolve waver for just a moment before she straightened her spine and lifted her chin with the quiet dignity that had become her only remaining armor. 3 weeks had passed since that fateful midnight kiss, 3 weeks of complete social exile, and now she stood at the threshold of what she had privately declared would be her final public appearance before retreating forever into the shadows of spinsterhood, determined to face whatever fresh humiliations awaited with the same cold composure that had carried her through the destruction of her world. The entrance hall soared above them in marble splendor, servants in Ravenscroft livery moving with silent efficiency to take wraps and direct guests toward the ballroom, and Eleanor noticed how conversation stuttered to a halt as she passed, heads turning to follow her progress, with expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt, while whispers rose in her wake like disturbed birds. Harriet's hand found hers, squeezing gently in support as they made their way through the crowd. And Eleanor was grateful for this one remaining friend who had refused to abandon her despite the social cost, though she knew even Harriet's loyalty had limits and could not shield her from what was to come. The ballroom doors opened onto a scene of breathtaking grandeur, crystal chandeliers casting rainbow light over silk-clad figures who moved through the patterns of a country dance, and Eleanor paused at the threshold, scanning the room with the practiced eye of one who had learned to identify threats and allies in an instant. There, holding court near the refreshment table, stood Lady Lydia Greville in rose-pink satin that complemented her celebrated beauty, surrounded by admirers who hung on her every word, and Eleanor's stomach tightened as those cold blue eyes found hers across the room, and a smile of pure malicious delight curved those perfect lips. The moment stretched taut as a bowstring before Lydia detached herself from her circle and glided toward Eleanor with the predatory grace of a cat stalking wounded prey, her voice carrying clearly over the music as she exclaimed with false sweetness How brave dear Miss Ashworth was to show her face after such a scandalous episode. And really, one had to admire such determination, even if it did border on the shameless. The words struck like physical blows, each one calculated to wound, and Eleanor felt the familiar heat of humiliation rising in her cheeks, even as she kept her expression carefully neutral, aware that dozens of eyes watched this confrontation with avid interest, waiting to see if the ruined Miss Ashworth would crumble or create an even greater scene. She murmured something non-committal, trying to edge past Lydia toward the relative safety of the wall, but the other woman moved to block her path, continuing her stream of barbed observations about desperate wallflowers and the importance of knowing one's place, until Eleanor felt her composure beginning to crack like ice under spring sun, and knew she had to escape before she gave them all the satisfaction of seeing her break. The library door beckoned from across the room, promising solitude and refuge from the crushing weight of society's judgment, and Eleanor made her excuses with as much dignity as she could muster, leaving Harriet to fend off Lydia's continued provocations while she fled toward that sanctuary, her grey silk skirts whispering across the polished floor as she slipped through the door and into blessed silence. The library door closed behind Eleanor with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden stillness, and she leaned against it for a moment, eyes closed, drawing in deep breaths of air scented with leather bindings and beeswax polish, while her heart gradually slowed from its panicked gallop to something approaching normal rhythm. The room stretched before her in shadowed magnificence, tall windows flanking one wall where heavy velvet drapes had been drawn against the winter night, while a dying fire cast dancing shadows across rows of books that climbed toward the coffered ceiling, and she moved toward the warmth instinctively, drawn by the promise of solitude and the blessed absence of watching eyes. A large portrait dominated the space above the marble mantelpiece, depicting a stern-faced gentleman in military dress whose dark eyes seemed to follow her movement, and Eleanor supposed this must be some Ravenscroft ancestor, probably as cold and forbidding as the current Duke was rumoured to be, though she had yet to glimpse their host among the glittering crowd. The fire popped softly as she held out her hands to its warmth, and she was so absorbed in the simple comfort of being alone, of not having to maintain her mask of dignified indifference, that she failed to notice the subtle shift in the shadows near the far corner, where a high-backed leather chair faced away from the door. "I wondered who would be the first to seek refuge from the glittering horde," came a deep voice from the darkness, causing Eleanor to start violently and press a hand to her racing heart as a figure unfolded from the chair with languid grace, moving into the firelight with a leather-bound volume still held loosely in one long-fingered hand. The man who emerged from the shadows was tall and lean, dressed entirely in black save for the gold signet ring that caught the firelight, and Eleanor's first thought was that he must be another social outcast like herself, perhaps a poor relation or unwelcome guest who had also sought sanctuary from the suffocating atmosphere of the ballroom. "Forgive me," she managed, her voice steady despite her surprise. "I believed the room to be empty, and did not mean to intrude upon your solitude, though I confess I understand the impulse to escape, for these events can be rather trying when one does not quite fit the mold of fashionable society." His lips curved in what might have been amusement as he set aside the book, and Eleanor caught a glimpse of Greek letters on the spine before he moved closer, studying her with dark eyes that seemed to see far more than she was comfortable revealing. "You speak as one well acquainted with the feeling of not belonging, miss," he prompted, and something in his tone, neither mocking nor pitying but simply curious, made her answer with more honesty than she had intended. "Ashworth," she supplied, lifting her chin slightly as she waited for the inevitable recognition, the shift from polite interest to salacious curiosity that her name now evoked. And yes, I am intimately familiar with the sensation of being unwelcome, though I suspect my reasons differ from yours, for you at least have the excuse of preferring Plato to empty pleasantries, while I have the distinction of being this season's most notorious cautionary tale. Instead of the expected reaction, his expression sharpened with what appeared to be genuine interest as he moved to pour himself a measure of brandy from a crystal decanter, gesturing to offer her a glass which she declined with a slight shake of her head. "Cautionary tale seems rather harsh," he observed, swirling the amber liquid thoughtfully. "Though I suppose society does love its dramatic narratives, particularly when they involve the fall of those who dare to hope for more than their allotted portion of happiness." The bitter truth of his words struck her like a physical blow, and Eleanor found herself speaking with a frankness that would have horrified her under normal circumstances, telling this sympathetic stranger how one stolen moment of believing herself worthy of love had destroyed everything she had built over 24 years of careful propriety. "The truly amusing part," she concluded with a laugh devoid of humor, "is that I cannot even claim the distinction of a grand passion or a thrilling scandal. Merely one midnight kiss from a man who found me so forgettable that he denied leading me anywhere at all, though I suppose I should be grateful to our host for providing such an elegant setting for my final public humiliation." The silence that followed her words seemed to thicken the very air between them, and she watched with growing unease as her companion's expression underwent a series of subtle changes, moving from sympathy through surprise to something that might have been chagrin. "Final public humiliation seems rather definitive," he said at last, setting down his untouched brandy with careful precision. "And I find myself curious about your opinion of our host, whom you seem to hold responsible for your current predicament." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized how ungracious she must sound, maligning the Duke in his own home, even if only to another guest who might well report her words, adding fresh fuel to the fires of gossip. "I spoke in haste," she said quickly, "and meant no disrespect to His Grace, whom I have not had the privilege of meeting, though I confess I find it difficult to summon much warmth toward a man whose elevated position allows him to play puppet master with the lives of those beneath him, hosting grand spectacles where lesser mortals perform for his amusement, while he remains above it all, untouched by the petty dramas that destroy ordinary lives." The man before her had gone very still, and something in his absolute motionlessness made Eleanor's words falter and die as a terrible suspicion began to dawn, her gaze moving from his severe black evening clothes to the signet ring bearing what she now recognized as the Ravenscroft arms, and finally to his face, where a mixture of amusement and something else entirely played across features that were younger than the portrait above the mantel but bore an unmistakable resemblance. "Your Grace," she breathed, mortification flooding through her in a hot wave as she dropped into a curtsy so deep she nearly lost her balance. "I had no idea. That is, I thought you were— Forgive me. I have been unpardonably rude." His hand appeared in her field of vision, steady and commanding, and she had no choice but to accept his assistance in rising, the brief contact of his fingers against hers sending an unexpected shock through her system that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with the way he continued to regard her with that unsettling intensity. "Frederick Ravenscroft," he said with grave formality that was somewhat undermined by the definite glint of humor in his dark eyes. "Disappointed puppet master and apparently inadequate host, though I must confess that in all my years of avoiding my own entertainments, this is the first time I have been so thoroughly castigated by someone who has not even had the courtesy to be properly introduced before delivering their critique." Eleanor fled the library with mortification burning in her cheeks, barely registering Frederick's voice calling after her as she pushed through the door and back into the glittering chaos of the ballroom, desperate to find Harriet and escape before she could compound her humiliation with further social disasters. But fate seemed determined to torment her, as Lady Lydia materialized directly in her path like some malevolent spirit summoned by her distress. "My dear Miss Ashworth," Lydia purred, her rose-pink gown seeming to glow in the chandelier light as she blocked Eleanor's escape route with practiced ease. "You look positively flushed, though I suppose skulking about in dark corners has that effect on those unaccustomed to proper society. And really, one must wonder what you hoped to accomplish by attending tonight, when everyone knows your reputation is quite beyond redemption." The words struck with surgical precision, each one calculated to wound, and Eleanor felt the familiar heat of shame mixing with anger as a small crowd began to gather, drawn by the scent of fresh scandal like sharks to blood in the water. "Lady Lydia," she managed through gritted teeth, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity, even as whispers rose around them, like a Greek chorus documenting her downfall. "I merely sought a moment of quiet contemplation, though I understand such concepts might be foreign to those who thrive on the misfortunes of others." Lydia's perfect features twisted into an expression of mock sympathy that made Eleanor's stomach churn as the other woman stepped closer, her voice carrying clearly to their eager audience as she continued her public dissection. "Misfortune suggests mere bad luck, rather than the natural consequences of throwing oneself at gentlemen who have no interest in damaged goods. And really, Miss Ashworth, your continued presence in polite society shows a shocking lack of propriety that even your unfortunate circumstances cannot excuse." The murmurs around them grew louder, faces pressing closer to witness Eleanor's final destruction, and she felt her composure beginning to crack like ice under spring sun, when suddenly the crowd parted as if cleaved by an invisible blade, conversations dying mid-syllable as Frederick Ravenscroft emerged from the library with an expression that could have frozen hell itself. His presence commanded instant attention, the very air seeming to chill as he moved through the crowd with deadly grace, and Eleanor watched in stunned confusion as he came to stand beside her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body despite the ice in his demeanor. "Lady Lydia," he said, and his voice carried the kind of quiet menace that made brave men reconsider their choices. "I find myself curious about your sudden interest in propriety, particularly given your own rather colorful history with married gentlemen, though perhaps you believe your beauty excuses behavior that you so eagerly condemn in others." The color drained from Lydia's face so quickly, Eleanor thought she might faint, and the gathered crowd seemed to hold its collective breath as the Duke continued in that same terrifyingly calm tone that nevertheless carried to every corner of the now silent ballroom. "Miss Ashworth is a guest in my home," he continued, his dark eyes never leaving Lydia's increasingly pale face. "And I find your treatment of her not merely discourteous, but actively offensive to my hospitality, suggesting as it does that I would invite unworthy persons to my entertainments, an implication I trust you will wish to correct immediately." Lydia's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish, no sound emerging as she struggled to process this unexpected reversal. And Eleanor felt her own shock mirroring that of the crowd as Frederick turned to her with a complete transformation of manner, his expression warming as he extended his hand with formal courtesy. "Miss Ashworth, I believe I hear the opening strains of a waltz, and I would be honored if you would partner me, unless you prefer to continue this fascinating discourse on propriety with Lady Lydia, though I confess I find the topic grows tedious." The invitation hung in the air like a challenge, and Eleanor found herself placing her trembling hand in his without conscious thought, allowing him to lead her toward the dance floor as whispers exploded behind them like fireworks. The implications of the ruthless Duke of Thornbury publicly defending and then partnering the ruined Miss Ashworth sending shockwaves through the assembled ton that would doubtless provide gossip for weeks to come. The orchestra struck up the opening notes of a waltz in G minor, its melancholy strains seeming to echo Eleanor's inner turmoil as Frederick led her onto the dance floor with a firm hand at her waist, and she felt the weight of every gaze in the ballroom pressing upon them like a physical force, while whispers rose and fell in waves around the perimeter of dancers who gave them a noticeably wide berth. His hand was warm even through her glove as he positioned them with practiced ease, and Eleanor found herself staring at his perfectly tied cravat rather than meeting those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed defenses, her body responding to the familiar steps even as her mind reeled with confusion at this unexpected turn of events. "You waltz beautifully," he observed as they began to move in perfect synchronization, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear despite their proximity to other couples. "Though I suspect that surprises you less than the fact that you are dancing at all, given your stated intention to disappear into social obscurity after tonight." Eleanor's chin lifted automatically at the gentle mockery in his tone, finding her voice despite the unsettling warmth of his hand against her back, and the way his fingers curled around hers with surprising gentleness for a man with such a fearsome reputation. "Your Grace seems determined to prevent that outcome," she replied, proud that her voice remained steady, even as her heart raced at their closeness. "Though I confess myself at a loss to understand why the Duke of Thornbury would concern himself with the fate of one ruined woman when he has the cream of society to choose from." His expression shifted subtly, something dangerous flickering in those dark depths as he executed a turn that brought her incrementally closer, close enough that she could detect the faint scent of sandalwood and something uniquely him that made her stomach perform an alarming flip. "Perhaps I find the cream of society rather sour," he murmured, "all milk and no substance, whereas you, Miss Ashworth, have the temerity to insult me to my face in my own library, which suggests either remarkable courage or complete social obliviousness, both of which I find infinitely more interesting than practiced flattery." The music swelled around them as they moved across the floor, and Eleanor became aware of the hushed quality of the conversations happening just beyond their bubble of space, knowing that tomorrow's gossip sheets would be full of speculation about this unprecedented display of ducal interest in damaged goods. "I know about your midnight kiss," Frederick said suddenly, the words dropping between them like stones into still water, causing Eleanor to miss a step that he smoothly corrected with subtle pressure at her waist. "And I find myself curious about the kind of man who would orchestrate such a moment only to deny it afterwards, though I suspect Lord Marcus Sinclair's character is precisely as shallow as his behavior suggests." Heat flooded Eleanor's cheeks at this casual mention of her shame, and she tried to pull back only to find his grip unyielding, keeping her close enough that she had no choice but to meet his searching gaze as mortification and anger warred within her chest. "Your Grace knows all the sordid details, then?" she said with bitter dignity, lifting her chin despite the tears that threatened. "How I allowed myself to believe that someone might actually want me, plain and bookish as I am. How I stood on that terrace like a fool while he kissed me at midnight, only to discover that I was merely a cruel joke, a dare, perhaps, or simple boredom on his part." Frederick's hand tightened fractionally on hers, and something shifted in his expression that she could not quite read, though the intensity of his gaze made her breath catch as they continued their circuit of the floor, the mournful waltz seeming to underscore the painful confession she had just made. "A single kiss does not define you," he said with quiet conviction that seemed to resonate through her entire being. "Nor does the cruelty of small minds determine your worth, Miss Ashworth, though I understand the tone would have you believe otherwise, and I find their eagerness to destroy you over such a trivial matter speaks more to their character than yours." Eleanor blinked rapidly against the sudden sting of tears at this unexpected defense, so different from the platitudes or silent judgment she had grown accustomed to, and she found herself searching his face for signs of mockery or worse, pity, but found only that steady regard that seemed to see past her scandal to something deeper. "Why?" she whispered, the word escaping without her permission as they moved through the final measures of the dance. "Why would you risk your reputation defending someone like me, when association with my scandal can only damage your standing?" His lips curved in what might have been a smile, though his eyes remained serious as he guided her through the final turn, and his answer, when it came, was delivered with such simple certainty that it took her breath away entirely. "Because, Miss Ashworth, I have spent 32 years surrounded by people who would never dream of challenging me, who see only my title and fortune, who agree with every word I speak and laugh at every poor attempt at humor I make. And then you walked into my library and told me exactly what you thought of me without even knowing who I was, and I realized I had been starving for honesty without even knowing I was hungry." The waltz ended with a flourish of strings, and Eleanor found herself being guided through the crowd by Frederick's steady hand at her elbow, still reeling from his extraordinary declaration about starving for honesty. And she barely registered the parting of the sea of curious faces until they stood before an elderly woman seated in what could only be described as a throne-like chair of burgundy velvet, her silver hair arranged in an elaborate style that belonged to an earlier era, and her sharp blue eyes assessing Eleanor with the kind of shrewd intelligence that made her grandson's penetrating gaze seem almost gentle by comparison. "Grandmamma," Frederick said with a warmth Eleanor had not yet heard in his voice, "may I present Miss Eleanor Ashworth, who has just done me the honor of dancing despite my terrible reputation for crushing the toes of my partners, though I am pleased to report that her feet remain intact and she has not yet fled screaming into the night." The Dowager Duchess of Thornbury raised one perfectly arched eyebrow at this unusual introduction, her gaze never leaving Eleanor's face as she lifted a jeweled lorgnette to examine her more closely, and Eleanor felt rather like a specimen under scientific observation as those keen eyes took in every detail from her modest grey gown to the flush still staining her cheeks from the dance. "So you are the young woman who has set the town ablaze with scandal," the Dowager said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from decades of social supremacy. "Though I must say you look remarkably composed for someone who has supposedly thrown herself at half the eligible men in London. Or was it all of them? Because these stories do tend to grow in the telling until one cannot separate truth from the most outrageous fiction." Eleanor felt her spine straighten automatically at this direct reference to her shame, but something in the old woman's tone suggested curiosity rather than condemnation, and she found herself responding with more spirit than wisdom might have dictated. "Your Grace exaggerates the reports. I believe it was only a quarter of the eligible men, though I confess I have been too busy perfecting my desperate spinster routine to keep an accurate count. And really, throwing oneself at gentlemen is quite exhausting work that leaves little time for proper record-keeping." A bark of surprised laughter escaped the Dowager, causing heads to turn throughout the ballroom, as such a sound had not been heard from her in recent memory, and Eleanor noticed Frederick's slight smile of what appeared to be approval as his grandmother leaned forward with increased interest. Wit and backbone. How refreshing in this age of simpering misses who faint at the slightest provocation, the Dowager pronounced, tapping her silver-handled cane against the floor for emphasis. "Tell me, Miss Ashworth, what do you make of my grandson? And please do not bore me with platitudes about his wealth and consequence, as I hear quite enough of that nonsense from the usual parade of husband-hunters." Eleanor glanced at Frederick, who was watching this exchange with an expression of barely concealed amusement, and decided that having already ruined herself, she might as well speak truthfully to this formidable woman who seemed to value honesty as much as her grandson claimed to ma'am. "I find his grace to be a study in contradictions," she said carefully, aware of the danger in her words, but unable to stop herself. Cold as winter to most, yet capable of unexpected kindness, dismissive of society's rules while perfectly embodying its power, and possessed of a library that suggests depths of thought and feeling that he takes great pains to hide behind a facade of ruthless indifference. The dowager's eyes sharpened with something that might have been approval or calculation, and she turned that penetrating gaze on her grandson, who had gone very still beside Eleanor, though she could not read the expression on his face without turning to look directly at him. "Perceptive as well as brave," the old woman murmured. Then louder, "Miss Ashworth, you will call on me tomorrow at 2 precisely. And bring that friend of yours hovering protectively behind that potted palm, as I find myself curious about any young woman who inspires such loyalty in the face of social destruction. And Frederick, do stop looking like you have swallowed something unpleasant, as your face might freeze that way." Before Eleanor could process this unexpected invitation or formulate a response, the dowager was already waving them away with an imperious gesture, turning to address another hovering courtier. And Frederick was guiding her back through the crowd with that same steady pressure at her elbow that suggested he was not quite ready to release her to the wolves of society. "You have passed the dragon's inspection," he murmured close to her ear, sending an involuntary shiver down her spine. "A feat many have attempted, and few have achieved. Though I suspect she knew she would like you from the moment you refused to grovel or simper in her presence." Eleanor found herself being deposited near where Harriet indeed stood by a large potted palm, her friend's eyes wide with questions that would doubtless keep them awake half the night. And as Frederick bowed over her hand with perfect formality that belied the intensity of their earlier interaction, she wondered what she had just set in motion by speaking truthfully to 2 of the most powerful people in society. "Until tomorrow, Miss Ashworth," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made it sound less like a polite farewell and more like a promise, before he turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Eleanor to face Harriet's excited interrogation and the weight of countless stares that followed her for the remainder of the evening, though none dared approach after the Duke's public claim of her company. Eleanor sat in the morning room with her needlework forgotten in her lap, watching dust motes dance in the pale January sunlight that filtered through the lace curtains, while her mind wandered yet again to that extraordinary evening at the Thornbury ball 5 days prior, when the Duke had danced with her and defended her, and looked at her with those dark eyes that seemed to see something in her that she could not see in herself, though she tried desperately to convince herself that such thoughts were the height of foolishness for a ruined woman who had no business dreaming of dukes or anything beyond quiet spinsterhood. The Morning Post had already been delivered and distributed by their aging butler, and Eleanor had observed without much interest as her father sorted through the usual collection of bills and correspondence, his face growing increasingly pinched with each envelope he opened, a reminder of their modest circumstances that had only grown more strained since the scandal that had sent Charlotte away to their aunt in Devon for her own protection. A knock at the door interrupted the heavy silence that had become their daily companion since her disgrace, and Eleanor heard the butler's shuffling steps in the hallway, followed by the unmistakable sound of quality paper being placed on a silver salver, though she paid it little mind until her father's sharp intake of breath made her look up from her pretense of embroidery. "Eleanor," he said, his voice strange and tight as he held up a heavy cream envelope that bore an elaborate crest pressed deep into burgundy wax. "This is addressed to you, from Thornbury." And she felt her heart perform a peculiar skip as she recognized the Ravenscroft seal, though she tried to maintain an expression of polite disinterest. even as her fingers trembled slightly when she reached for the letter. The paper was of the finest quality, thick and smooth beneath her fingertips as she broke the seal and unfolded it to reveal an elegant, feminine hand that could only belong to the Dowager Duchess, inviting Miss Eleanor Ashworth and her companion, Miss Harriet Pembroke, to attend a winter house party at Thornbury Estate, beginning February 1st. The wording formal yet somehow warm in a way that suggested genuine welcome rather than mere social obligation. "Absolutely not," her father pronounced, before she had even finished reading, his face flushing an alarming shade of red as he rose from his chair. "I will not have you courting further scandal by accepting invitations from that family, regardless of their consequence, as you have already brought quite enough shame upon this household with your midnight indiscretions, and I will not stand for any continuation of this nonsense." Eleanor felt something cold and hard crystallize in her chest at his words, a protective shell forming around the fragile hope that had dared to bloom despite her best efforts to crush it. And she found herself standing to face him, with a calm that surprised them both, her voice steady, as she spoke words that seemed to come from some deeper well of strength she had not known she possessed. "Father, I am already ruined in the eyes of society, my reputation destroyed beyond any hope of repair, and Charlotte has been sent away because of my shame while Mother lies ill upstairs, too weak to face the gossip that follows our family name like a curse," she said, watching his face grow even redder as she continued with quiet determination. "So tell me, what more can they possibly take from me that has not already been stripped away by cruel whispers and cold shoulders and the kind of social death that leaves one breathing but not truly living?" The silence that followed her question seemed to stretch endlessly, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sound of carriage wheels on cobblestones outside their window, until finally her mother's voice drifted down from the doorway where she stood wrapped in a shawl, looking fragile as porcelain but with eyes that held unpected understanding. "Let her go, Henry," her mother said softly, moving into the room with careful steps that betrayed her weakness even as her expression remained resolute. "Eleanor is right that she has little left to lose, and perhaps the Dowager Duchess sees something in our daughter that we have been too blinded by shame to recognize, and I would rather she find some small measure of happiness, even briefly, than watch her fade away in this house like a flower deprived of sunlight." Her father's protests sputtered and died under her mother's steady gaze, and Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes at this unexpected support from the woman who had seemed too overwhelmed by illness and scandal to offer much comfort in recent weeks. Though she managed to maintain her composure as she carefully refolded the invitation and held it against her chest like armor. "I will write to Harriet immediately," Eleanor said, knowing her dear friend would accompany her without hesitation, despite the risk to her own reputation. "And we shall travel to Thornbury as invited, accepting whatever comes with the full knowledge that I am already beyond redemption in society's eyes, but perhaps not yet beyond the reach of kindness from those who choose to see past scandal to the person beneath." Later that evening, as she penned her acceptance with careful strokes, Eleanor allowed herself one moment of pure, dangerous hope as she remembered the Duke's voice saying that a single kiss did not define her, and though she knew better than to dream of anything more than a pleasant house party where she might briefly escape the suffocating disappointment of her father's house, she could not quite stop her traitorous heart from wondering what might await her at Thornbury, where Frederick Ravenscroft resided with his formidable grandmother, and his unexpected kindness, and those dark eyes that seemed to promise something she dared not name. The carriage wheels crunched over frozen gravel as they approached Thornbury Estate through an avenue of ancient oaks whose bare branches formed a cathedral arch overhead, and Eleanor pressed her face to the window, despite knowing it was undignified, unable to resist her first glimpse of the place that had occupied her thoughts for the past week since accepting the Dowager's invitation. While Harriet dozed fitfully in the opposite corner after 2 days of travel over winter roads that had left them both exhausted yet filled with nervous anticipation. The dying light of the February afternoon painted the approaching manor house in shades of gold and shadow, revealing grey stone walls that seemed to have grown from the earth itself rather than been built by human hands, with mullioned windows that caught the sunset like mirrors and reflected it back in dazzling display. And Eleanor felt her breath catch at the sheer magnificence of it all, so different from their modest London townhouse, or even the grandest homes she had visited during her brief time in society before her fall from grace. Snow dusted the formal gardens visible beyond the drive, transforming hedges and topiaries into fantastical shapes that seemed to dance in the gathering dusk, while smoke rose from multiple chimneys to dissipate against a sky turning from amber to deep violet. And she wondered which of those windows belonged to Frederick's chambers, then chided herself for such improper thoughts, even as her traitorous heart beat faster at the knowledge that he was somewhere within those walls. The carriage slowed as they approached the main entrance where torches had already been lit against the approaching darkness, their flames casting moving shadows across the carved stone portico, and Eleanor smoothed her travelling dress with hands that trembled slightly, knowing her appearance was far from ideal after their journey, but hoping the failing light might hide the worst of the dust and wrinkles. She nudged Harriet gently awake as footmen in Ravenscroft livery emerged to attend to their arrival, their expressions professionally neutral, though she thought she caught a flicker of curiosity in their eyes, no doubt wondering about the scandalous Miss Ashworth, who had somehow secured an invitation to this exclusive gathering despite her ruined status. As she descended from the carriage with as much dignity as her stiff muscles would allow, Eleanor's gaze was drawn to a figure striding across the courtyard from the direction of the stables, and her heart performed that now familiar skip as she recognized Frederick's tall form even before she could properly see his face, his dark hair wind-blown, and his riding clothes suggesting he had indeed been out with his horses, as she had imagined he might be on such a crisp winter afternoon. He reached them just as Harriet emerged from the carriage looking slightly green from their journey, and Eleanor was struck anew by how his presence seemed to charge the very air around them, making her acutely aware of her travel-worn state, even as his dark eyes swept over her with what looked remarkably like pleasure at her arrival. "Miss Ashworth, Miss Pembroke," he said, executing a bow that managed to be both perfectly proper and somehow intimate in its attention. "Welcome to Thornbury, and I trust your journey was not too arduous, though I see the roads have taken their toll, and you must be eager for the warmth of a fire and perhaps some refreshment after such a long trek through this unseasonable cold." His voice held that particular combination of formal courtesy and underlying warmth that she had begun to recognize as uniquely his, so different from the icy indifference he showed to most of society, and Eleanor found herself relaxing slightly despite her exhaustion and nerves, managing what she hoped was a graceful curtsy, even as her knees protested the movement. "Your Grace is very kind," she replied, proud that her voice remained steady despite her awareness of his intense regard. "And Thornbury is even more beautiful than I had imagined, though I confess my imagination fell far short of the reality, as it seems the sort of place that belongs in fairy tales rather than the mundane world we inhabit daily." A slight smile touched his lips at her words, and he gestured for them to precede him into the house, falling into step beside them as they entered a great hall that took Eleanor's breath away with its soaring ceiling, ancient tapestries, and massive fireplace where logs the size of small trees burned with welcoming heat. "My grandmother is holding court in the drawing-room with the other guests who have already arrived." Frederick informed them as they paused to let their eyes adjust to the warm glow of candlelight after the gathering darkness outside. "But I have instructed Mrs. Pemberton to show you to your rooms first, so you might refresh yourselves, as I suspect you would prefer not to face the assembly in your current state, though I assure you that you look perfectly charming despite the rigors of travel." The compliment, delivered in that matter-of-fact tone that somehow made it more believable than flowery protestations would have been, brought heat to Eleanor's cheeks, and she was grateful for the dim lighting that might hide her blush as a stern-faced housekeeper appeared, as if summoned by magic to lead them up a ground staircase lined with portraits of stern-faced Ravenscroft ancestors. Just as they reached the first landing, Frederick's voice stopped them with a final comment that made Eleanor's pulse race with a mixture of anxiety and something else entirely. "I should warn you that Lady Greville is among our party, having secured an invitation through her connection to my cousin, though I trust you will not allow her presence to diminish your enjoyment of your stay, as you are here as my grandmother's particular guest, and therefore under the protection of this house, which I assure you is not given lightly." Eleanor had discovered quite by accident on her second evening at Thornbury that the library remained largely deserted after dinner when the other guests gathered in the drawing-room for cards and gossip, and she had slipped away from the suffocating small talk to find solace among the towering shelves of leather-bound volumes that seemed to reach toward the coffered ceiling like ancient trees in a forest of knowledge, only to find Frederick already ensconced in a wing-backed chair near the fire with a volume of Byron's poetry in his hands and an expression of such profound concentration that she had nearly retreated before he looked up and smiled that particular half-smile that made her pulse quicken despite her best efforts at maintaining proper detachment. "Miss Ashworth," he had said, rising with that fluid grace that seemed at odds with his intimidating reputation, "I wondered if you might find your way here eventually, as you strike me as someone who values the company of books over the empty chatter that passes for conversation in most drawing-rooms." And something in his tone suggested he had perhaps been hoping for just such an encounter, though Eleanor tried not to read too much into what might simply be courtesy toward a guest. Now, 2 evenings later, what had begun as chance meetings had evolved into an unspoken arrangement, where they would both drift away from the assembled company after dinner, to reconvene in this sanctuary of mahogany shelves and Morocco bindings, where the fire cast dancing shadows across the spines of countless volumes, and the world beyond the library doors seemed to fade into insignificance, leaving only the crackle of flames and the whisper of turning pages and conversations that ranged from philosophy to poetry with an ease Eleanor had never experienced with anyone else. "Do you know," Frederick said on this particular evening, looking up from the volume of Plato he had been perusing while Eleanor worked her way through a collection of Wordsworth's verses, "I believe you are the first person in years to whom I have been able to speak without feeling the need to maintain the facade that society expects of a duke, that cold and ruthless demeanor that keeps others at a distance, but also ensures one is forever isolated behind walls of their own construction." The admission, delivered in that thoughtful tone she had come to recognize as his most genuine voice, made Eleanor set aside her book to study his face in the firelight, noting the way the harsh lines around his mouth had softened during their days at Thornbury, and how his dark eyes held something almost vulnerable when he looked at her, as if he too was discovering something unexpected in these quiet evening hours they shared. "Perhaps," she ventured carefully, aware that she was treading on delicate ground but emboldened by the intimacy of the moment, "we all wear masks to protect ourselves from a world that seems determined to wound us, and it is only in rare moments of genuine connection that we dare to lower them, though I confess I never expected to find such a moment here, given my current status as society's favorite cautionary tale about the dangers of midnight kisses and misplaced trust." Her words, meant to be lightly self-deprecating, seemed to strike something in him, for his expression darkened not with the cold anger she had seen him direct at others, but with something that looked almost like pain, and he set aside his book with deliberate care before speaking again. "You speak of wounds and masks, as if you alone bear scars from society's cruelties," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the fire rather than her face. "But I assure you that even dukes are not immune to betrayal, though in my case it was not a midnight kiss that brought my downfall, but rather a very public rejection at the altar when my bride-to-be decided that my fortune was not quite compensation enough for what she termed my insurmountable deficiencies of character, a phrase that London society took great delight in repeating for months afterward." The revelation hung in the air between them like a bridge suddenly spanning the chasm of their different social positions, and Eleanor felt her heart constrict with unexpected empathy for this man who had seemed so invulnerable in his power and position. Understanding now why he had reacted so strongly to her own public humiliation, and why these evening conversations seemed to matter as much to him as they had come to matter to her. "How curious," she said softly, daring to meet his eyes with a directness that would have been impossible just days before. "That we who have been deemed unworthy by those who judge only surfaces should find ourselves here, discovering depths in each other that our detractors could never fathom, and I find myself thinking that perhaps their rejection was not our failure, but theirs, in being too blind to see what truly matters in another human soul." The smile that spread across his face then was unlike any expression she had seen him wear before, not the sardonic twist of lips he showed to society or the polite curve he offered to his guests, but something genuine and warm and achingly real that transformed his harsh features into something almost beautiful. And when he laughed, actually laughed with real mirth at her observation, the sound was so unexpected and delightful that Eleanor found herself laughing too, their shared amusement echoing through the library like music. "Miss Ashworth," he said, when their laughter had subsided into companionable smiles, "I do believe you may be the wisest person I have encountered in all my years of navigating society's treacherous waters, and I find myself looking forward to these evening discussions with an anticipation I have not felt for any social engagement in longer than I care to remember." And as their eyes met across the space between their chairs, Eleanor realized with a mixture of joy and terror that she felt exactly the same way, that these stolen hours in the library had become the highlight of her days at Thornbury, and that perhaps she was allowing her carefully guarded heart to hope for something more than just intellectual companionship, though she dared not name what that something might be. The morning air bit sharply at Eleanor's cheeks as she stepped onto the frost-covered terrace at precisely 10 o'clock, having received Frederick's unexpected note at breakfast suggesting she might enjoy seeing the lake in its winter glory. And though she had hesitated briefly at the propriety of such an excursion, the thought of spending time with him away from the watchful eyes of the other guests had proven too tempting to resist, especially after their increasingly intimate library conversations had left her yearning for more of his company in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. Frederick was already waiting by the stone steps that led down to the lake path, his black greatcoat making him a dark silhouette against the pristine white landscape, and the smile that transformed his features when he saw her approach sent warmth flooding through her despite the bitter cold, making her grateful for the blue wool cloak with its fur trim that might hide the color rising in her cheeks. "Miss Ashworth," he said, offering his arm with a formality that seemed almost playful, given their growing familiarity. "I thought you might appreciate seeing my favorite retreat on the estate, though I confess I have shared it with very few people over the years. as solitude has generally been my preferred companion until quite recently." And the meaningful look that accompanied these words made Eleanor's heart skip in a way she was finding increasingly difficult to ignore or rationalize away as mere gratitude for his kindness. They descended toward the lake in companionable silence, broken only by the crunch of their footsteps on the frozen ground and the distant cawing of crows from the bare trees that lined the water's edge. And Eleanor found herself stealing glances at Frederick's profile, noting how the cold had brought color to his usually pale cheeks and how his dark hair curled slightly where it escaped from beneath his hat, details she had no business noticing, but which seemed to imprint themselves on her memory nonetheless. "The summer house is just across the lake," he explained, as they reached the shoreline, where the water had frozen solid enough to walk upon, tested daily by the groundskeepers to ensure its safety. "And though it seems an odd destination in winter, I find there is something particularly peaceful about it when surrounded by ice and snow, as if the cold strips away all pretense and leaves only what is essential and true." Words that seemed to carry weight beyond their surface meaning, as if he were speaking of more than just a simple structure across the frozen water. As they began their careful progress across the ice, Eleanor became acutely aware of his presence beside her, the way he shortened his naturally long stride to match hers, how his hand hovered near her elbow, ready to steady her if needed, the visible puffs of his breath in the cold air that seemed to mingle with her own in the still morning, and she found herself talking more freely than she had with anyone save Harriet, sharing memories of childhood winters when she and Charlotte would skate on the small pond near their country home before their mother's illness and their father's financial troubles had changed everything. "I sometimes wonder," she found herself confessing as they neared the middle of the lake where the ice was clearest, and she could see the dark water beneath, "what my life might have been if I had been born beautiful like Charlotte, or wealthy enough that beauty mattered less. Though I suppose such wondering is foolish when we cannot change the circumstances of our birth, only how we choose to face them." And she felt rather than saw Frederick stop walking, his sudden stillness drawing her attention to his face, where an expression of such fierce protectiveness had overtaken his features that it quite stole her breath. "You truly do not see it, do you?" he asked, his voice low and intense in a way that made her pulse race. "The way your eyes light when you speak of something you love, how your whole being seems to glow when you laugh, the elegant way you move through a room as if you belong everywhere and nowhere all at once, the sharp intelligence that makes every conversation with you an adventure rather than a chore." And he seemed about to say more when Eleanor's foot found a patch of rougher ice, causing her to stumble forward with a small cry of alarm. His hands were at her waist instantly, strong and sure through the layers of wool and fabric, catching her before she could fall and drawing her against him in a movement that was pure instinct. And for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, they stood frozen on the ice, her hands braced against his chest where she could feel the rapid beat of his heart that matched her own racing pulse. His face so close she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes and feel the warmth of his breath against her cheek. Neither of them moved to step away, the moment holding them captive as surely as any physical bonds. And Eleanor saw something shift in his expression, a hunger and longing that matched the ache in her own chest, before he seemed to recall himself, and carefully, reluctantly, set her back on her feet, though his hands lingered at her waist a heartbeat longer than strictly necessary, and she knew with a certainty that terrified her that she was falling in love with him, had perhaps been falling since that first dance at his London ball, when he had looked at her and seen not the ruined girl society had labelled her, but simply Eleanor, worthy of defence and desire and something that looked dangerously like devotion. The afternoon tea had been laid out in the blue drawing-room with its tall windows overlooking the snow-covered gardens, and Eleanor found herself seated between Harriet and Lord Thomas Fleming, a young gentleman who had arrived at Thornbury only the day before, and whose handsome features and easy charm had already made him a favourite among the ladies, though Eleanor barely noticed his attempts at conversation as her eyes kept drifting toward Frederick, who stood near the fireplace engaged in what appeared to be a tense discussion with his estate manager. His jaw set in that particular way she had come to recognize meant something had displeased him greatly. Lord Fleming, seemingly undeterred by her distraction, leaned closer to reach for the sugar bowl in a movement that brought him unnecessarily near to Eleanor's person, his voice warm with admiration as he complimented her on the becoming shade of her afternoon dress, a simple creation of dove-grey wool that she had chosen for its modesty rather than any attempt at fashion, and she murmured something appropriately polite while wondering why Frederick had not joined them for tea, as had become his custom over the past days at Thornbury. "Miss Ashworth," Lord Fleming continued, his blue eyes bright with interest that seemed genuine enough, though it puzzled Eleanor greatly, given her current status as society's pariah. "I understand from Lady Pembroke that you are quite accomplished at the pianoforte, and I confess myself eager to hear you play, as I am something of a musician myself and always delighted to find a kindred spirit in matters of art and culture." Words that would have pleased her immensely just weeks ago, but now seemed hollow compared to the discussions of philosophy and literature she had shared with Frederick in the library's intimate confines. From across the room, Lady Lydia Greville observed the interaction with a smile that did not reach her calculating eyes, and Eleanor felt a familiar chill of apprehension as the beauty glided toward them with deliberate grace, her silk skirts rustling like whispered threats as she approached their small gathering with an expression of false sweetness that immediately put Eleanor on her guard. "How delightful to see Lord Fleming has discovered our dear Miss Ashworth," Lydia purred, settling herself on the nearby sofa in a deliberate display of her perfect posture and exemplary breeding. "Though I do hope someone has warned him about her unfortunate tendency toward midnight encounters on terraces, as we would not want another gentleman to find himself compromised by her rather forward behavior." Words delivered with such honeyed venom that even Lord Fleming looked uncomfortable at the unveiled cruelty. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, but forced herself to maintain her composure, though she could not help but notice how Frederick had turned from his conversation at Lydia's words, his dark eyes finding Eleanor's across the room with an intensity that made her breath catch before he deliberately turned away again, resuming his discussion as if the moment had never occurred, leaving Eleanor feeling suddenly bereft in a way that frightened her with its intensity. "I find," Lord Fleming said with unexpected firmness, that made Eleanor regard him with new interest, "that gossip often reveals more about the speaker than the subject, and I prefer to form my own opinions based on personal observation rather than the whispered speculations of those who seem to have nothing better to occupy their time." A defense that should have warmed Eleanor's heart, but instead only emphasized Frederick's continued silence and apparent indifference to Lydia's attack. The conversation continued around her like the buzzing of particularly tiresome insects, but Eleanor found herself withdrawing into her own thoughts, wondering if she had misread the growing intimacy between herself and Frederick, if perhaps those evenings in the library and that charged moment on the frozen lake had meant far more to her than to him, a possibility that sent such a sharp pain through her chest that she had to set down her teacup for fear of revealing her distress through trembling hands. Lady Lydia, sensing blood in the water like the predator she was, leaned forward with mock concern that fooled no one present, her voice dropping to a stage whisper designed to carry to every corner of the room as she addressed Eleanor with false sympathy that dripped with satisfaction at causing pain. "Of course, you must not take His Grace's absence personally, dear Eleanor, as I understand from my dear friend the Marchioness of Westbury that he has been in correspondence with several suitable ladies this season, including her own daughter, who is quite the diamond, and would make any duke a perfect duchess, possessing as she does all the qualities of birth, beauty, and spotless reputation that such a position requires. Each word carefully chosen to wound, to remind Eleanor of everything she was not, and could never be in the eyes of society. The silence that followed Lydia's pronouncement seemed to stretch endlessly, broken only by the soft clink of china as Harriet set down her cup with rather more force than necessary, and Eleanor found herself frozen in place, unable to look toward Frederick to see if he had heard Lydia's poisonous words, unable to bear the thought that they might be true, that while she had been falling helplessly in love with him during their quiet evenings together, he had been pursuing more suitable matches as any sensible duke would do. Lord Fleming attempted to draw her back into conversation, his kind efforts to distract her from Lydia's cruelty only serving to highlight Frederick's continued silence, and Eleanor felt something inside her chest crack and splinter like ice beneath an unexpected weight. The pain of it stealing her breath as she realized how foolish she had been to allow hope to take root in her heart when she knew, had always known, that she was not the sort of woman men like the Duke of Thornbury married, no matter how many libraries they might share, or how many walks across frozen lakes might make her pulse race with possibilities that would never, could never, come to fruition. Eleanor excused herself from the drawing-room as soon as she could manage without appearing to flee, though in truth that was precisely what she was doing. Escaping to the sanctuary of her chamber, where she could nurse her wounded heart in private, without the burden of maintaining a pleasant expression, while Lady Lydia's poisonous words echoed in her mind, and Frederick's apparent indifference carved fresh wounds in her already battered defences, and she had barely reached the haven of her room when the tears she had been holding back through sheer force of will finally broke free, sliding down her cheeks in silent testimony to her foolishness in believing even for a moment that a man like the Duke of Thornbury could truly care for someone like her. The elegant chamber with its view of the frozen lake that had delighted her upon arrival now seemed to mock her with its luxury, reminding her of all the ways she did not belong in this world of wealth and privilege where even friendship could be withdrawn at a moment's notice, and she sank onto the window seat, pressing her forehead against the cold glass as she watched the sun sink toward the horizon, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold that seemed far too beautiful for the ugliness she felt inside. A soft knock at her door made her stiffen, and she quickly wiped at her cheeks, though she knew the evidence of her distress would still be visible, calling out permission to enter while expecting to see Harriet's concerned face. But instead the door opened to reveal the Dowager Duchess herself, leaning heavily on her silver-handled cane as she surveyed Eleanor with those sharp, sapphire eyes that seemed to see everything and judge more fairly than her grandson apparently did. "Do not look so surprised, child," the old woman said, closing the door behind her with a decisive click before making her way to the chair near the fireplace, settling herself with the natural authority of one who had never doubted her welcome anywhere, "as I make it my business to know when one of my guests has been driven to tears by the machinations of that viper Lydia Greville, whom I only tolerate because her mother was a particular friend, though I begin to think that friendship has been sorely tested by the daughter's behavior." Eleanor found herself moving from the window seat to take the chair opposite the Dowager, drawn by something in the older woman's tone that suggested understanding rather than censure, and she folded her hands in her lap to still their trembling as she tried to find words that would not sound like the pitiful complaints of a woman who had forgotten her place and reached for things beyond her grasp. "Your Grace is very kind," she managed, her voice steadier than she had expected. "But I assure you that Lady Lydia said nothing that was not already known to me, as I am well aware of my position and the impossibility of expecting anything beyond basic civility from those so far above my station." Words that tasted bitter on her tongue, but which she felt compelled to speak, as if acknowledging the truth might somehow lessen its power to wound. The dowager's snort of derision was surprisingly unladylike and all the more endearing for its honesty, and she fixed Eleanor with a look that brooked no argument as she leaned forward slightly, her rings catching the firelight as she gestured dismissively at Eleanor's words as if they were particularly bothersome flies to be swatted away. "Nonsense and folly," the dowager pronounced, with the certainty of one who had lived long enough to recognize both when she encountered them. "As anyone with eyes can see that my grandson has been half in love with you since that first dance in London, though he is managing the situation with all the grace of a bull in a china shop, which I suppose is to be expected given his unfortunate history with matters of the heart. Though that is a story for him to tell when he finally comes to his senses and stops acting like a fool." The words sent Eleanor's heart racing even as her mind rejected them, too afraid to hope again after the afternoon's painful reminder of reality. And she found herself shaking her head slowly, unable to meet the dowager's knowing gaze as she struggled to explain what seemed so obvious to everyone but this remarkable old woman who insisted on seeing possibilities where none existed. "But your grace must know that I am ruined," Eleanor said quietly, the words scraping her throat raw with the effort of speaking them aloud. "And whatever his grace's kindness toward me, surely he understands that a duke cannot ally himself with a woman who has been so thoroughly rejected by society, whose very presence at a gathering causes whispers and speculation, who brings nothing but scandal and shame to any association." Truths that cut deep even as she spoke them, each word another stone added to the wall she was building around her heart to protect it from further damage. The dowager's cane tapped sharply against the floor, a sound that commanded attention and brooked no self-pity. And when Eleanor finally raised her eyes to meet that penetrating gaze, she found something there that looked remarkably like affection mixed with exasperation, as if she were dealing with a particularly stubborn but beloved grandchild who insisted on missing the obvious. "My dear girl," the dowager said with a gentleness that brought fresh tears to Eleanor's eyes, "do you truly think my grandson cares one whit for the opinion of society when he has spent the last decade defying their expectations at every turn, when he has refused every matchmaking mother's attempts to snare him for their simpering daughters, when he has earned the title of ruthless duke precisely because he follows his own counsel rather than bowing to the demands of those he considers beneath his notice?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge and a promise all at once, and Eleanor found herself remembering all the moments over the past days when Frederick had sought her company, the conversations in the library that had stretched late into the night, the way his eyes had softened when she made him laugh, and the careful way he had held her on the ice as if she were something precious rather than something shameful, memories that warred with the afternoon's pain in a battle for her heart's allegiance. The dowager's words hung in the air between them like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman, and Eleanor wanted desperately to grasp it, but found her fingers numb with the cold fear of disappointment, her heart already so battered that she could not bear the thought of exposing it to further harm. Yet something in the old woman's fierce certainty made her pause in her self-protective retreat as the dowager continued with a determination that would have been amusing in less fraught circumstances. "That boy," the dowager said with the fond exasperation of a grandmother who had watched her grandson make a muddle of things, "has the unfortunate habit of believing himself above such petty emotions as jealousy, which is why he is currently stalking about his own estate like a caged wolf, rather than simply telling you that the sight of Lord Fleming mooning over you at tea made him want to challenge the poor man to pistols at dawn, though of course he would never admit to such a thing, stubborn creature that he is." The revelation sent Eleanor's thoughts spinning as she tried to reconcile this image with the cold indifference she had witnessed in the drawing-room, and she found herself gripping the arms of her chair as if they might anchor her in a world that had suddenly tilted off its axis, her voice emerging as barely more than a whisper when she finally found the courage to speak. "But he said nothing when Lady Lydia spoke so cruelly, and he turned away as if my distress meant nothing to him," she said, the hurt still fresh enough to bring tears to her eyes, despite her best efforts to maintain composure. "And how can your Grace speak of jealousy when he showed only indifference to both Lord Fleming's attentions and Lady Lydia's venom?" The dowager's laugh was surprisingly robust for a woman of her years, and she shook her head with the air of one dealing with particularly obtuse children who insisted on misunderstanding the simplest things, her cane tapping against the floor in emphasis as she leaned forward to fix Eleanor with a look that brooked no argument or self-delusion. "My dear girl, have you learned nothing of my grandson in your time here, or has that sharp intelligence I so admired in London deserted you entirely in the face of a handsome face and broad shoulders?" the old woman asked with gentle mockery that somehow managed to be kind rather than cruel. For Frederick has never been one to display his emotions for public consumption, particularly not in a room full of gossips and vipers who would delight in using any sign of attachment against both him and the object of his affections, which is precisely why he maintains that legendary control, even when I suspect he would prefer to throw Lord Fleming from the nearest window. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest at these words, a tiny flame of hope that she had thought thoroughly extinguished beginning to flicker back to life despite her best efforts to smother it. And she found herself remembering the intensity in Frederick's eyes when he had turned at Lydia's words, the way his jaw had tightened with what she had read as displeasure, but might have been something else entirely, something more protective and possessive than she had dared to imagine. "Furthermore," the dowager continued with the satisfaction of one warming to her theme, "if you had been observing as carefully as I have, you would have noticed that my grandson excused himself from his own drawing-room not 5 minutes after you fled, and unless I am very much mistaken, he is currently wearing a path in his study carpet while cursing himself for a fool and trying to determine how best to undo the damage his ridiculous behavior has caused. Though knowing Frederick, he will likely make matters worse before he makes them better, as men are wont to do when their hearts are engaged and their pride wounded." The image of Frederick pacing his study in distress over her was so at odds with the cold, controlled Duke, she thought she knew that Eleanor found herself struggling to reconcile these two versions of the man who had come to mean far too much to her in far too short a time, and she realized with a start that perhaps she had been guilty of the same assumptions society made about her, seeing only the surface and missing the depths beneath. "I tell you this," the dowager said, rising from her chair with surprising grace for one who relied so heavily on her cane, "not to encourage you to forgive his foolishness too easily, for men must learn that their actions have consequences, but rather to prevent you from fleeing Thornbury before the story has reached its proper conclusion, as I suspect you were planning to do, given that I observed your maid beginning to pack your things when I passed your door earlier." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks at being so easily read, but before she could form a response, the dowager had crossed to the door with decisive steps, pausing only to deliver one final pronouncement that left Eleanor speechless with its implications, and the affection clear in every word despite the stern delivery. "You will join us for dinner this evening," the dowager commanded with the authority of one who had never been denied, "wearing your finest gown, and you will hold your head high as befits a woman who has captured the heart of the most sought-after duke in England, whether he has the sense to admit it yet or not. And if my grandson continues to act the fool, well, I have not lived this long without learning a few things about knocking sense into stubborn male heads, particularly when those heads belong to Ravenscroft men who seem to believe that showing emotion is tantamount to showing weakness." With that remarkable statement, the dowager swept from the room, leaving Eleanor alone with her tumultuous thoughts and a heart that persisted in hoping, despite all rational arguments against it, and as she rose from her chair to gaze out at the frozen lake, where she and Frederick had walked just days before, she found herself wondering if perhaps, just perhaps, the Dowager was right, and this story had not yet reached its ending. Though what that ending might be, she dared not imagine for fear of the pain that would surely follow if her hopes proved false once again. Eleanor descended the grand staircase at precisely 8 o'clock, her finest gown of midnight blue silk whispering against each step as she forced herself to maintain a measured pace despite the wild beating of her heart. The Dowager's words still echoing in her mind as she tried to reconcile the image of Frederick pacing his study in distress with the cold, controlled Duke she had witnessed that afternoon, and though she had spent the past hour alternating between hope and despair while Harriet dressed her hair with extra care, she still felt woefully unprepared for whatever this evening might bring. The dining-room doors stood open before her, revealing a glittering tableau of crystal and candlelight where the other guests had already assembled, and she paused for just a moment on the threshold, gathering her courage like armor as she prepared to face whatever new humiliations Lady Lydia might have prepared, only to find her breath catching in her throat as Frederick himself appeared at her elbow, having apparently been waiting for her arrival with an attentiveness that sent warmth flooding through her, despite her best efforts to remain guarded. "Miss Ashworth," he said, his voice low and formal, but with something in his dark eyes that made her pulse quicken. "May I have the honor of escorting you to dinner?" And before she could form a response, he had offered his arm with a courtly gesture that drew the attention of every person in the room, including Lady Lydia, whose perfect features twisted into something decidedly unpleasant as she watched the Duke of Thornbury lead the ruined Eleanor Ashworth to the place of honor at his right hand. The meal passed in a blur of conversation that Eleanor barely registered, too aware of Frederick's presence beside her, the way his fingers brushed hers when he passed the salt, the protective way he redirected conversation whenever Lady Lydia attempted one of her barbed comments, and most of all, the intensity of his gaze when he looked at her, as if he were trying to convey something urgent that could not be spoken aloud in company. Though what that message might be, she dared not guess for fear of misreading the situation once again. It was only when the ladies withdrew to the drawing-room, leaving the gentlemen to their port, that Eleanor found herself cornered by Lady Lydia, whose silk skirts blocked her path to the settee where Harriet waited, and the beauty's smile was sharp as broken glass as she leaned in close enough that her cloying perfume made Eleanor's eyes water, her voice pitched low but venomous as she hissed, "I do hope you enjoyed your moment of triumph at dinner, though we both know it cannot last, as even a duke must eventually bow to society's demands. And society will never accept a woman who threw herself at a gentleman on a darkened terrace like a common—" But the crude word she would have spoken died on her lips as the drawing-room door opened and Frederick himself entered, followed by the other gentlemen who looked somewhat startled by their host's precipitous abandonment of the traditionally lengthy male ritual of port and cigars, his eyes finding Eleanor immediately and darkening with what she now recognized as carefully controlled fury at finding her trapped by Lady Lydia's malice once again. The drawing-room seemed to shrink as Frederick crossed the space with deliberate steps, his dark eyes never leaving Eleanor's face as he approached with a controlled fury that made even the boldest guests step aside, and Lady Lydia found herself backing away from Eleanor as if pushed by an invisible force, her perfect features arranging themselves into an expression of innocence that fooled no one as Frederick reached them and positioned himself quite deliberately between Eleanor and her tormentor, his voice cutting through the sudden silence like a blade wrapped in silk. "Lady Lydia," he said with a courtesy so cold it burned, "I believe Lord Fleming was just expressing his desire to hear you play the pianoforte, a treat I'm certain we would all enjoy, particularly as it would give your remarkable talents a more appropriate outlet than the conversation you were attempting to pursue with Miss Ashworth." and though his tone remained perfectly civil, there was something in his bearing that brooked no argument, a reminder that this was his domain, and his word was law within these walls. Lady Lydia's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish, as she struggled to find a response that would not make her situation worse. But Frederick had already turned his attention to Eleanor, offering his arm with a gesture that was both protective and possessive. His voice gentling considerably as he said, "Miss Ashworth, I believe you expressed an interest in seeing the conservatory, and as the evening is unusually mild for February, perhaps now would be an opportune moment for that tour I promised." Completely ignoring the fact that Eleanor had expressed no such interest, and he had made no such promise, though she found herself accepting his arm without hesitation, too grateful for the rescue to question his methods. The conservatory proved to be a wonder of glass and iron attached to the east wing of the house, filled with exotic plants that perfumed the air with the scent of jasmine and orange blossom, creating an almost tropical warmth that was startling after the chill of February, and Eleanor found herself breathing deeply as Frederick led her along the winding paths between towering palms and delicate orchids, neither of them speaking for several long moments as the tension of the drawing-room encounter slowly ebbed away, replaced by an awareness that was entirely different, but no less intense. "I owe you an apology," Frederick said at last, stopping beside a fountain where water trickled musically over moss-covered stones, his profile stern in the moonlight that filtered through the glass overhead as he struggled with words that clearly came difficult to a man unaccustomed to admitting fault. "For this afternoon I behaved abominably, allowing my own struggles with an emotion I had thought myself above to cause you pain, which is unforgivable when you have already endured so much undeserved cruelty from those who should know better, including Lady Lydia, whose presence here I deeply regret. Though she came as companion to my cousin, and I could not refuse without causing the very gossip I sought to avoid." Eleanor felt her heart constrict at this oblique reference to jealousy, remembering the Dowager's words about Frederick's reaction to Lord Fleming's attentions, and she found herself studying his face in the dim light, seeing for the first time the vulnerability beneath the legendary control as he continued, "You must understand, Miss Ashworth, that I have spent the better part of a decade believing myself immune to the softer emotions, content with my books and my solitude after an experience that taught me the danger of trusting too deeply, yet you have somehow managed to disturb that carefully constructed peace in ways I find both terrifying and oddly exhilarating. Though I handled it with all the grace of a green boy rather than a man of 32 who should know better." The confession hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed, and Eleanor found her voice at last, soft but steady, as she said, "Your Grace, I too owe an apology, for I allowed my own fears and past hurts to color my interpretation of your actions, assuming coldness where perhaps there was only confusion, and fleeing rather than seeking understanding." Her fingers tightening unconsciously on his arm as she gathered courage to continue. "But you must know that your behavior this afternoon, coupled with Lady Lydia's poison, very nearly sent me running back to London, convinced that I had once again mistaked kindness for something more meaningful, a mistake that has already cost me everything society values." Frederick turned to face her fully then, his hands coming to rest gently on her shoulders as he looked down at her with an expression that stole her breath, all masks finally discarded as he spoke with quiet intensity. "Eleanor, and I hope you will forgive the liberty of using your given name, but Miss Ashworth seems too formal for what I must say. You could never be mistaken for anything less than extraordinary by anyone with eyes to truly see. And if society cannot recognize your worth, then society is composed of fools whose opinion matters less than nothing. For you are witty where they are vapid, genuine where they are false, brave where they are cowardly, and beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with the superficial standards by which they judge. The words washed over Eleanor like a warm tide, each one healing wounds she had thought too deep to mend, and she found tears sliding down her cheeks as Frederick's thumbs came up to brush them gently away, his touch reverent as he continued. I have watched you face cruelty with dignity, respond to spite with grace, and maintain your integrity when lesser souls would have crumbled, and if I have been clumsy in showing my admiration, if my own fears have caused me to wound where I meant to worship, then I can only beg your forgiveness and hope that you might give me the chance to prove that not all men are as worthless as Marcus Sinclair, who, by the way, has been drinking himself into oblivion at White's ever since word reached him that the Duke of Thornbury had taken particular interest in the woman he so carelessly discarded. The mention of Marcus should have brought pain, but Eleanor found that particular ghost had lost its power to wound, eclipsed entirely by the man standing before her with his heart finally laid bare, and she reached up to cover his hands with her own, her voice trembling, but certain as she whispered, Frederick, you have nothing to prove to me, save that this moment is real and not another dream from which I must wake to find myself alone and forgotten once more. And his response was to draw her closer, until she could feel the rapid beat of his heart beneath his perfectly tailored evening coat, his voice rough with emotion as he said, Then let me spend every moment from now until forever proving exactly how real this is, how cherished you are, and how thoroughly I intend to make society acknowledge what I have known since that first evening in my library, that you are incomparable, irreplaceable, and utterly essential to whatever happiness I might hope to claim in this life. And as his lips finally found hers in a kiss that was nothing like that desperate midnight encounter with Marcus, but instead spoke of promise, permanence, and a passion built on genuine understanding, Eleanor felt the last of her walls crumble, allowing herself to believe that perhaps happy endings were not merely the province of the novels she so loved, but might actually exist for overlooked daughters of modest barons who had the courage to hope for more than society told them they deserved. The days that followed the conservatory kiss unfolded like pages from a dream Eleanor scarcely dared believe was real, for Frederick had transformed from the distant, guarded duke into something far more wonderful and terrifying, a man who sought her company at every opportunity, whose dark eyes followed her across crowded rooms with an intensity that made her blood sing, and whose rare smiles, once hoarded like precious gems, now appeared with increasing frequency whenever she spoke, as if her words alone held the power to illuminate something long dormant within him. The other guests had noticed the change, of course, for nothing escaped the keen observation of the ton, and whispers followed Eleanor like shadows, though these new murmurs carried a different quality than those that had haunted her since New Year's Eve's tinged now with speculation rather than condemnation, curiosity rather than cruelty, as society struggled to comprehend how the ruined Miss Ashworth had apparently captured the attention of the most eligible and elusive bachelor in England. Lady Lydia's fury had become a palpable thing, radiating from her perfect features whenever she witnessed Frederick and Eleanor together, which was often, for the Duke seemed determined to make his preference known to all who had eyes to see, walking with Eleanor in the gallery, partnering her at cards, ensuring she was seated beside him at every meal until even the most obtuse observer could not mistake his intentions. Harriet had cornered Eleanor in her bedchamber on the morning of February 14th, Valentine's Day as it happened, her eyes bright with barely contained excitement as she demanded to know everything, and Eleanor had found herself confessing the kiss in the conservatory, the tender words exchanged, the way Frederick had held her hand beneath the table at dinner the previous evening, his thumb tracing gentle circles against her palm while maintaining a perfectly composed expression for the benefit of their fellow guests. The Dowager Duchess had summoned Eleanor to her private sitting room that same afternoon, and Eleanor had gone with trepidation, uncertain whether she was to receive a blessing or a warning. But the old woman had merely smiled with satisfaction as she gestured for Eleanor to sit beside her on the silk damask settee, her shrewd eyes softening as she said that she had not seen her grandson so animated since before his father's death, sir, and that whatever magic Eleanor possessed, she should continue to wield it liberally, for Frederick deserved happiness after years of self-imposed isolation and the wounds left by that dreadful Beaumont girl who had nearly destroyed him. The revelation that Frederick's broken engagement had been to a Miss Beaumont, details the Dowager shared with characteristic bluntness, painted a picture of betrayal that made Eleanor's heart ache for the younger man he had been, idealistic and trusting before a calculated fortune hunter had taught him that love could be a weapon wielded against the unwary. And she understood now why her own lack of pretense had struck him so forcefully, why he valued honesty above beauty and substance above social standing. For he had learned through bitter experience exactly what artifice could cost a heart foolish enough to believe in pretty lies. The evening of February the 14th brought with it a transformation that even Eleanor could not have anticipated, for Frederick had arranged a small entertainment in the music room, ostensibly to celebrate the feast of St. Valentine, though he claimed to find such traditions sentimental nonsense. And yet the chamber had been decorated with hothouse roses whose fragrance filled the air with summer sweetness, and candles flickered in crystal holders that cast prismatic light across the assembled guests like scattered diamonds. And Eleanor found herself seated beside the Dowager Duchess with Harriet on her other side, watching as various guests performed musical pieces of varying quality. Lady Lydia's technically perfect but soulless rendition of Mozart receiving polite applause, while Lord Fleming's surprisingly tender tenor voice earned genuine appreciation. And throughout it all, Eleanor felt Frederick's gaze upon her like a physical touch, warm and possessive, and filled with a promise that made her pulse quicken beneath the modest pearl choker she wore at her throat. When the performances concluded and guests began to mingle, Frederick appeared at Eleanor's side with 2 glasses of champagne, offering one to her with a slight bow that held none of the formality such gestures usually carried between them, his fingers brushing hers deliberately as she accepted the crystal flute. And he leaned close enough that only she could hear as he murmured that he had arranged a special gift for her. But it required her presence in the conservatory at precisely 10 o'clock, and before she could respond, he had moved away to attend to his duties as host, leaving her flushed and breathless with anticipation that warred against the voice of caution that had served her so poorly before. Harriet noticed her distraction immediately, pressing her for details with the persistence of a true friend, and Eleanor found herself confessing the assignation in whispered tones, watching as Harriet's eyes widened with mingled excitement and concern. For even a ruined woman must be careful of her reputation when a duke was involved, particularly one whose intentions remained technically undeclared, despite the obvious nature of his attentions. The clock seemed to move with agonizing slowness as Eleanor attempted to engage in normal conversation, her thoughts entirely consumed by what awaited her among the tropical plants and moonlit glass. And when the hour finally approached, she slipped away from the music room with a murmured excuse about seeking air, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the entire assembly must hear it, as she made her way through the darkened corridors toward the east wing, the scent of jasmine and orange blossom growing stronger with each step, until she pushed open the conservatory door and found herself in a wonderland of candlelight and flowers. Frederick stood beside the fountain where they had shared their first kiss, but the space around him had been transformed into something from a fairy tale, with hundreds of candles illuminating the glass walls until the conservatory glowed like a lantern against the February darkness, and roses of every color imaginable had been arranged along the pathways, their petals scattered across the stone floor like a fragrant carpet, and as Eleanor approached with trembling steps, she saw that Frederick held something in his hands, a small velvet box that made her breath catch and her eyes fill with sudden tears, for she understood now what this evening truly meant, what gift he intended to offer beneath the stars visible through the glass ceiling above them. Frederick closed the distance between them with measured steps, his dark eyes never leaving her face as moonlight and candlelight merged to cast him in silver and gold, and when he spoke his voice carried a tremor she had never heard before, a vulnerability that stripped away every vestige of the ruthless Duke and revealed simply a man standing before the woman he loved, with his heart laid bare upon the altar of hope. "Eleanor," he said, and her name had never sounded so beautiful as when shaped by his lips in this moment. "I have spent 32 years building walls around myself, convincing myself that solitude was strength and that needing no one meant I could never be wounded again. But you have demolished every defense I constructed with nothing more than your honesty, your wit, your courage in the face of cruelty that would have broken lesser souls. And I find myself undone by a woman who accidentally insulted me in my own library and then proceeded to argue philosophy with me, as though I were merely a fellow scholar rather than a duke whose very name makes strong men tremble." He opened the velvet box to reveal a ring that stole what remained of Eleanor's breath, an oval sapphire surrounded by diamonds that caught the candlelight and scattered it into 1,000 tiny stars, clearly an heirloom of immense value and even greater significance. And Frederick lifted it from its cushion with fingers that she noticed were not entirely steady, as he continued speaking with an intensity that seemed to cost him everything he had guarded so carefully for so long. "This ring belonged to my mother," he said softly, "and her mother before her, passed down through generations of Ravenscroft brides, and I swore after Miss Beaumont that no woman would ever wear it, that I would let the line end rather than risk such betrayal again. But you have taught me that the greater risk lies in never trusting at all, in building a fortress so impregnable that one becomes a prisoner within its walls rather than a lord protected by them." He took her hand in his, and she could feel the slight trembling that matched her own as he pressed his lips to her knuckles before meeting her eyes once more. "Eleanor Ashworth," he said, "daughter of a modest baron, woman scorned by the very society I am expected to lead, you are worth more than every titled lady who has thrown herself at my fortune, more than the diamonds and estates and the power of my name. And I am asking you, begging you if I must, to do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my duchess, my partner, my love, for however many years God grants us together." The tears that had threatened now fell freely down Eleanor's cheeks as she looked at this man who had seen her at her lowest and chosen to lift her rather than look away, who had defended her when defense seemed futile and pursued her when prudence would have counseled retreat, and she whispered the only word that mattered, the only word that could possibly capture everything swelling within her heart as he slid the sapphire ring onto her trembling finger, where it fit as though it had been waiting across generations for this precise moment.